All right, so we see some numbers trickling in. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it about 10-20 seconds to let participants fill up so we don't have you miss anything, but we're so excited you're here, and we'll get started in just a few seconds. So nice to see familiar names, new names, really great. All right, so it looks like the numbers are slowing down, so I'm going to get us started and respect all of your time. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the second webinar in our NBME series. We are thrilled to have you with us today. This series is sponsored by the Docs with Disabilities Initiative, Access in Medicine or AIM program, and the University of Michigan Center for Disability Health and Wellness, Michigan Medicine. Our focus during the next hour will be to help all of you and explain how to effectively work with providers, create a timeline with students, and write an impactful letter of support on behalf of your students. Before we begin, we want to take a moment to introduce ourselves to you. My name is Sarah Triano, and I am the chair of Access in Medicine, a working group of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm also the director of the Center for Learning Excellence at Geisinger College of Health Sciences. In this program, I provide academic advising and support services to our medical students, as well as oversee disability services for the entire college. My educational background is in clinical mental health counseling and post-secondary disability services, and I'm a licensed professional counselor. I have personal lived experience with disability, and I will switch between person-first and identity-first language throughout today's session. I will let my wonderful co-presenters introduce themselves. Kara?
Hello, everyone. My name is Kara James. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I currently work as a disability access resource specialist at the Mayo Clinic College of Medicine and Science, where I work with learners in our medical school, School of Health Sciences, Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences, and our School of Continuous Professional Development. My educational background is in vocational rehabilitation, with certifications in vocational evaluation and rehab counseling. I have been working in higher ed disability services for the past 20+ years, including at the University of Wisconsin-Stout, Purdue University, and Winona State University. I'm honored to be here with you today. Now I'll hand it over to our colleague, Becca.
Hi, everyone. I'm Becca Güler, she and her, a longtime learning specialist for university and medical school students, including UTMB, JSOM, academic support, and career counseling, now on a part-time seasonal basis. As owner of On-Call Advising and Consulting, I provide executive function coaching to high school through professional level students, as well as learning expertise for test prep, test anxiety management, and exam-related disability accommodation advising. I'm a continuous participant in the NIH-funded SCORE, that's Scientific Communication Advances Research Excellence project, as the neurodiversity expert and as a second language learners content contributor. I enjoy working as a consultant to educate and train faculty in supporting neurodiversity and disabilities among students, research trainees, and residents. I designed the provider letter guide and template we'll be referencing today, and I'm really excited to share this valuable tool with you. This webinar is intended to provide some general information about applying for accommodations on the USMLE Step exams. The authors of this guide are not the experts in the National Board of Medical Examiners, NBME, process. So we defer to the NBME for official guidance on the process as they evaluate and determine accommodations for the Step 1, 2, and 3 exams. This document offers a supplement for students and disability resource professionals, also referred to as DRPs, to unpack the hidden curriculum of the process based on our collective experience supporting students to request accommodations on high-stakes exams.
Thanks, Becca. I want to share again this crucial message written by Drs. Neera Jain and Lisa Meeks. It reads, We remain concerned about the inequities that exist prior to medical education. For example, access to specialists, diagnosis, and high-quality documentation, financial and educational resources for early identification of disability, and supportive intervention, and in the provision of accommodations for education and high-stakes exams in medical training. We recognize that these inequities disproportionately affect students of color, those that are first generation to college, and those from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. These students enter medicine disadvantaged by a myriad of structural and cultural barriers that persist throughout medical training. Our hope is that this guide provides DRPs and medical school leadership one level of support for their trainees. We encourage medical school leaders and DRPs to take seriously the barriers posed by an inherently privileged process and to provide students the maximum level of support possible. This support will increase students' chances of full and equitable access to the exam and decrease the intense burden on students with disabilities who are already balancing personal, family, social, health, and academic priorities. Please keep in mind that consultants, while helpful if hired by the schools to support all students, can further perpetuate inequities, as not all students have access to this level of support. To further equalize access to assistance and knowledge, we vow to make Docs with Disability Initiative resources, including this series, the new guide, a video, and trainings, free and accessible to all.
Thank you, Sarah. There are some important acknowledgements that we want to make prior to diving into content today. First of all, you will hear us use the acronym DRP throughout today's presentation. As a reminder, DRP stands for Disability Resource Professional. Please know, in the context of today's presentation, DRP is not necessarily a job title. Rather, we are referring to job responsibilities. This includes any staff that work in the space of helping to ensure that disabled students have equitable learning and training experiences. We acknowledge that DRPs are balancing various caseloads and job responsibilities. Consequently, the amount of time that DRPs are able to devote to assisting students through the NBME accommodation process varies across institutions. We also want to acknowledge that some schools have designated DRPs that work with their medical school and the School of Graduate Medical Education. Some schools have other designated staff that support students through the NBME process. Again, the level of support provided to learners varies across institutions. We also want to recognize the importance of having designated DRPs in medical education. The more times that we work through the NBME accommodation process, the better we become at it. Consequently, the better we are able to support our students. As you all attending here today likely know, medical education is very nuanced. In our work, the details are so important. For this reason, we encourage schools to consider having specifically designated DRPs for medical education, and also to be mindful of their caseload that allows them to properly support the students.
Before diving into the content, let's review what we intend to cover today. We will review the why and how of collaborating with providers, the importance of an effective timeline, and what goes into a strong letter of support. We'll also leave plenty of time for answering questions at the end. Please place your questions in the Q&A and be assured that we will get to them after making our way through the content. We ask that attendees please refrain from providing answers to others' questions. Here are our learning objectives. Our hope is that by the end of this webinar, you're able to identify key elements to an effective accommodations request timeline, understand how to meaningfully collaborate with providers on student documentation, and articulate the components of a well-written DRP letter of support.
All right. Establishing an effective timeline. One of the most challenging aspects of requesting accommodations for students with disabilities, is the timeline. Students have a lot on their plates when beginning medical school. Students don't typically sit for step 1 until after completing their preclinical education, and thus are encouraged to focus on the curriculum rather than the licensing exam that they may be taking in a year or two. Unfortunately, this message is a little bit more nuanced when it comes to students with disabilities. Though they do not need to start medical school thinking about preparing for the STEP series, they do need to begin considering their needs for accommodations. What we will do next is walk through the timeline required to submit requests in ample time for students to receive their decision with enough time to schedule before any institutional testing deadlines, and to prepare a reconsideration request if that is necessary. We have divided the timeline into 3 sections. The first section is pre-matriculation to over 1 year prior to the exam. The second section is 6 months to 12 months prior to the exam. And the third section is 1 month to 3 months prior to the exam. So let's start by taking a look at that first section, pre-matriculation to over 1 year prior to the exam. Understanding our students' needs begins during our very first interactions with them. Often this occurs during pre-matriculation, at which point students are identifying their disability-related needs, filling out an application for accommodations, sharing provider documentation, and completing a full interview with a DRP. Information gathered from these can begin to suggest what documentation might need to be secured. Even as early as pre-matriculation, it can help to address with students the complex nature of USMLE accommodation requests. As a part of the toolkit, there is an appendix that outlines the student's timeline. Sharing this can be helpful as it gives context to why conversation needs to occur this early. Consider the recency of the documentation, noting that the NBME indicates, quote, in most cases, the professional evaluation should have been conducted within the past 3 years, end quote. Though more recent documentation may be necessary for relapsing or remitting conditions or conditions that can change as a result of time or treatment. If an updated evaluation is deemed necessary, students should secure a provider to complete an updated evaluation or should see their treating provider to obtain documentation. This is also a helpful time to build out the timeline with the student. Students should be encouraged to begin crafting their personal statements. Fortunately, our team will cover the ins and outs of personal statements in our final webinar. This can be the most daunting part for students, so beginning this personal statement early is very critical. Finally, students should request official transcripts of their MCAT score reports, which are required by the NBME. Students should also begin gathering any historical documentations related to their disability, including prior accommodation approval letters and previous evaluations. Again, this can sometimes feel like a scavenger hunt, so starting early is really important. Moving on to the second section of the timeline, and that is the 6 months to 12-month time frame prior to the exam. At approximately the 10-month stage, students should have a solid draft of their personal statements and they should share it with their DRP. Since we are likely the most informed in terms of this process, DRPs have an essential role in reviewing personal statements. Carefully review the do's and don'ts as outlined in this toolkit to be sure that students are appropriately advocating for their needs and not inadvertently poking holes in their own case. Students should have secured their updated evaluation at this stage. Review it closely and make sure it is signed and dated. If there are any issues with this, address them immediately. You may refer to this documentation in your letter of support, so pay attention to the objective data. DRPs should begin crafting their letters of support at this stage. For DRPs, this part can be the most daunting part of the process. These letters should be thoughtful, comprehensive, and individualized to the student. In the same way that we suggest students begin their statements early, so too should we. 8 months prior to the exam, students should finalize their personal statement. Additionally, they will apply for the USMLE ID number. Sue thoroughly reviewed this process during our previous webinar. Students should start to consider what prometric centers are in their geographic region, being particularly mindful of what accommodations they are requesting. For example, not all prometric sites can accommodate a private testing space. This is also a good time to finalize your letter of support and review it with your student, making any necessary adjustments. 6 months before the planned testing date, students should complete the request for test accommodations form. This form should be combined in a PDF with the signed personal statement, evaluation report, DRP letter of support, certification of prior accommodations form, official MCAT score reports, and any additional documentation identified and collected. Students should carefully review the full packet for accuracy and completeness, referring back to the initial crafted checklist. The final request packet should be submitted via email to disabilityservices@nbme.org. Please note that the PDF cannot be larger than 15 megabytes. If a PDF larger than 15 megabytes is sent, delays will occur as the NBME will be unable to access the file. Students will need to resubmit the request in multiple parts. DRPs are advised to expressly and emphatically communicate to students that they should receive confirmation that their request is received and completed within 24 to 48 business hours. If no confirmation is received, the student should reach out directly to NBME to determine whether the request is received and complete or if there is an issue. The importance of this cannot be overstated. In missing this step, students' timelines can be completely disrupted and there can be major consequences for them. The third section of the timeline is 1 to 3 months prior to the exam. Students and DRPs alike will anxiously await the accommodations determination. The NBME indicates that they take approximately 60 business days to make their determination. Remember, the entire process is being plotted backwards. Ample time needs to be built in to account for receiving a response, submitting a reconsideration request if needed, and scheduling a test date. The hope is that about 3 months or so prior to the exam, students receive the decision. Ideally, the students' accommodations are approved and they can skip to the final part of the timeline. Unfortunately, that is not always true, and students are either provided partial accommodations or no accommodations. At this stage, students should meet with their DRP to discuss options. If students choose to submit a reconsideration request, they must submit a signed and dated letter accompanied by new substantive supporting documentation. Students should carefully review their denial letter to gain a sense of why the request was denied. These reasons should be directly addressed in additional documentation, the student's letter, and/or a letter from the DRP. Of important note, students are only allowed to submit one reconsideration request per eligibility period, so the request should be completed well. Fortunately, this toolkit includes a student checklist related to accommodation denials. A month or two before a student's intended test date, students should schedule their exam. At this point, they should have received their initial determination and, if needed, their reconsideration decision, and thus the NBME will have released the hold on their scheduling permit. Students can then choose their date and testing center. It can be helpful for students to call the specific prometric site to ensure they are prepared and equipped to provide the approved accommodations. During the first webinar, Grace shared that for a small fee, students are able to schedule a practice exam at the testing center. Let's briefly look at what happens when students request accommodations on subsequent step exams. The good news for students is that for students applying for the same accommodations that were previously approved, the process is fairly simple. Students would complete the subsequent request for test accommodations form and submit it to the NBME Disability Services email address. If students want different or additional accommodations than they were previously approved for, they should still complete the subsequent request for test accommodations form, but will need to provide additional documentation to support the new or differing request. As an important aside, students can still apply for accommodations for their second or even third step exam if they did not have them on their first step exam. Depending on the onset and type of disability, the request may differ in the likelihood of being approved. The process of determining how reasonable the request is and whether it is a solid one should be carefully navigated between the student and DRP. But there should not be a hard and fast rule around applying for accommodations on subsequent step exams.
So if you all attended our first webinar, you'll remember that the NBME answered some of our commonly asked questions prior to this series. We have included a few of their responses again in today's session. So for this question, we asked them, schools of medicine and disability providers within the schools must participate in the interactive process, review documentation, and determine, then implement accommodations in a timely manner, usually within a 60 to 100 minute intake appointment, with maybe one follow-up meeting for complex accommodations. Given this, why does the NBME require 60 plus business days to respond to students, and how can the NBME mitigate this time delay to provide greater equity for students navigating this requirement? So in the response to this, the NBME stated, almost all medical schools have a total enrollment in the hundreds, and some smaller percentage of those students may request school-based accommodations. The NBME, in contrast, receives thousands of requests for test accommodations each year. NBME does not know the process used by any particular medical school in reviewing school-based accommodation requests, but given the importance of the USMLE in the medical licensure process and the interest of maintaining the fairness and integrity of the standardized examination for all examinees, while also ensuring that appropriate testing accommodations are provided when necessary, the NBME reviews each request and its supporting documentation thoroughly, sometimes multiple times, to ensure due care is given to the request. The NBME also sometimes sends documentation out for external review to assist in the decision-making process. The NBME does not always require 60 business days to respond to requests for accommodations, but asks examinees to plan for approximately 60 business days to allow for appropriate review on NBME's end and ensure more reliable planning for the candidate. The NBME also has expedited procedures in place for examinees who request the same accommodation, what Kara was talking about, the subsequent, they were previously approved for to receive on a step examination, and for examinees who seek extra break time, but not extra testing time. Okay, now let's shift gears and learn a little bit about working effectively and collaboratively with providers. Becca?
Hi, the student's healthcare provider is an important contributor to a solid accommodations request. It's helpful to treat your work with these providers as a partnership where each individual is honored as an expert in their field. When navigating accommodations requests, it's helpful to frame out expertise in 3 areas. The student is the expert on their own experience of their own disability. The DRP is the expert in disability services and the interplay of disabilities with the school's learning environment, and the provider is the expert on the specific disability that they're evaluating. By respecting each individual's expertise, we can build trusting relationships that allow us as DRPs to share information related to the NBME's requirements without seeming like we are telling providers how to do their jobs. Now we have an introduction to our appendix. It's usually the case that providers need to fill out an organization's form on behalf of a student or employee for disability accommodations purposes. So it's likely to be the first time the provider has been asked to provide a free-form letter for this purpose. The provider letter guide and template were created to make the process clearer and more straightforward for the provider, with the hope that it is also smoother and faster for the student. The appendix includes this guidance based on denials or requests for additional documentation, which have been received and shared by actual students applying for NBME accommodations within the last 2 years. This includes highly specific details that a provider may not be aware of or desired. Sometimes students and even DRPs are not sure who is appropriate from a healthcare perspective to evaluate and attest to their disability. The NBME states, the evaluating professional should have training and direct experience in the diagnosis and treatment of adults in the specific area of disability. With that in mind, DRPs should consider the disability type when supporting the student in determining an evaluator. For example, a primary care physician might not be appropriate to evaluate and support a student's request related to low vision. Similarly, a licensed professional counselor may not have the educational background and expertise to complete the assessments required to diagnose a specific reading disability. It's important to note that while educational diagnosticians are commonly utilized for ADHD accommodation purposes in K-12 and university level education, it is often necessary to utilize a neuropsychiatrist for a full testing battery when applying for licensure standardized exams. When choosing and working with a provider, it's crucial to fill the provider in on the length and requirements of the NBME accommodations request process, as well as discuss their communication timeframes and methods. Now, we want to look at the minimum that's necessary. So as our wonderful presenters of the previous webinar explained, the NBME are the arbiters of their own disability accommodations process. They carefully outline specifics related to what they expect to see from providers and reports. At minimum, any provider documentation needs to be on official letterhead and contain their full name, professional credentials, current title, mailing address, email address, and telephone number. Additionally, the documentation must be both signed and dated. These may seem like minor details, but as we continue to emphasize the importance of the timeline, it becomes clear how much details matter. If students submit documentation that is unsigned or insufficient, their request will be delayed. As stated on the USMLE website, student requests are audited for completeness. If a request is deemed insufficient, or if documentation does not meet the requirements, such as missing pages or lack of signature, students would be notified in writing to address the issues, thus delaying review of their request. For this reason, the devil is in the details. Take the time as a DRP to assess for completeness on all documentation before the student submits. We strongly recommend using the provider letter guide or template in the appendix to check the letter and alert the student if relevant info seems to be missing, so that they can consider consulting the provider for edits or additions before submitting. The goal is preventing a delay due to requests for missing information. So how do we ensure providers know what is expected? Well, there are a few options at our disposal. One of the most effective ways is for DRPs to utilize letter templates to send with students to their appointments. So we've crafted a template that's in the appendices of the toolkit that should assist with this. The goal of this template is to thoughtfully and respectfully communicate NBME expectations to the providers, being mindful of the nature and characteristics of the disability and factors of the USMLE testing experience, such as the test format, setting, and length of the testing day. If this is not possible, DRPs can communicate through students and encourage the healthcare provider to review the USMLE website to review NBME requirements. A third option, which is especially feasible if relationships have been built with providers, is for the DRP to have direct communication with the provider. If this is the chosen avenue, it's helpful to share the most salient indicators of the disability type indicated by the NBME, share the website information with them, and remember that the provider is the expert on the test battery. Now let's take a quick look at Appendix D. This is the provider letter and or report writing prompts and examples. So in Appendix D of the guide, you'll find a provider letter guide. As you can see from the screenshot, the guide uses subject headers to break up the areas that the provider needs to address, and then provides guiding questions to use within each topic. We have some, if we can click the slides, I have highlighted where those areas are. Okay. So you can see the subject headers and the guiding questions. For Appendix E, which is the template for the provider, you'll find an actual template that providers can consider using. You'll see that it includes built-in format reminders, such as letterhead and date, and then options for wording. And if we can click, those will be highlighted on the slide. Great. This template then includes a series of if X applies, then include Y sections. The purpose of the template is to offer an option for faster guided writing of what can otherwise be a slow and painstaking process for providers to do well.
All right. Let's review another question that we submitted to NBME. It reads, what are some common missteps you note in initial applications that create delays in determination for students? Here is what NBME had to say. There may be a lack of information from examinees and their treating or evaluating professionals regarding the symptoms the examinee experiences from their claimed impairments and how these symptoms impact their functioning as compared to most people, particularly when taking a standardized examination like the USMLE. Specific examples of real-world functional limitations are helpful, but are frequently omitted from accommodation requests. There also may be a lack of information or a clear rationale regarding how the requested or recommended accommodations will specifically address the examinee's reported functional limitations relative to accessing the USMLE. Where available, it is helpful for examinees to submit objective documentation that demonstrates impaired functioning affecting the examinee's. Hello? Oh, sorry. When available, it is helpful for examinees to submit objective documentation that demonstrates impaired functioning affecting seem to have some technical difficulty. I'm going to ask, can somebody give me a sign that they can hear me? Seems like my mute.
Yes, we can hear you, Kara.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, I'm just going to go back just a little bit and continue with NBME's response to our question that was asked. So when available, it is helpful for examinees to submit objective documentation that demonstrates impaired functioning affecting the examinee's ability to access the USMLE under standard conditions. For some conditions, such as neurodevelopmental disorders, there should be some objective historical evidence of impaired functioning, regardless of when the diagnosis was made, given the nature of the disorder. For disorders that are not developmental, objective evidence that shows current impairment in functioning should be submitted if possible. Examinees should also be aware that accommodation applications are not deemed complete and ready for review until the examinee is registered to test with a current eligibility window. We often see delays when applications are not complete in terms of exam registration, meaning the STEP exam application has not been completed yet by the examinee's registration entity, such as NBME, ECFMG, or FSMB. Examinees may submit their accommodation requests to disability services at any time, but their file is not submitted for full review until the STEP exam registration is completed with a current eligibility period window. Examinees do not need to wait for the start of their 3-month eligibility period, however, to apply for accommodations. They may complete their registration well in advance or when they anticipate testing, and may submit their request to NBME as soon as the registration is complete or about to be complete. So for example, if an examinee wants to test in May and they're able to register for the exam the preceding September, they may also submit their request for test accommodations at that time. Now we will review the final portion of the content for today. Sarah?
Thanks so much, Kara. So the final topic we are covering today is the DRP letters of support. These letters can be incredibly impactful in the student's request. As we stated previously, you as the DRP are the expert in this context. You know the student well, and you know their barriers as they existed in medical school and testing environments. You know the basics of the law, and you know the USMLE exams. The primary goal of the letter of support is to combine all of the evidence available into one salient argument that supports the need for accommodations on the USMLE exam, taking into consideration the exam duration, multiple choice question format, the length of question stems, mobility or ergonomic concerns, and specific personal or medical needs. So before delving into the letter, we want to briefly discuss the certification of prior accommodations form. This is a form that is required by the NBME and should be completed by the DRP or the medical school official responsible for overseeing disability services. Sometimes this form is very sparsely filled. Remember, every piece of the packet is an opportunity to strengthen or weaken the request. DRPs should be thoughtful when completing this form. Accurately document the accommodations utilized by the student and use language of functional limitations when identifying the rationale for the accommodations provided. Though we are soon going to review the key components of a strong letter of support, I also want to reiterate and acknowledge here that this process is inherently challenging due to systemic factors beyond the student or staff member's control. Sometimes staff only have a limited amount of time that they're able to dedicate to each individual student due to exorbitant caseloads. But because of this, we want to encourage using this form to underscore the functional impact of the student's disability in the medical education setting. So in the guide, the letter of support is defined by 3 important sections. We will review those today. The first section of the letter is an opportunity for DRPs to outline their role at the school and their relationship to the student, as well as their specific educational and professional qualifications and expertise. In this portion, DRPs are advised to include the student's name, their USMLE number, and the date the student registered with the disability office. In the second section, the DRP should describe each of the accommodations for which the student was approved and the environments in which they use them. They should also explain the process utilized to determine the appropriateness of the accommodations and what specific functional barriers they ameliorate. Be mindful of the various domains impacted by the disability, not just the academic setting. At this stage, it can be helpful to refer to specifics from the student's evaluation report. Highlight any objective evidence that supports the need, and be particularly mindful of the average person standard, which we'll delve into more in the guide itself. Consider the breadth of accommodations process. We spoke previously of the timeline and how conversations around disability should happen early and often. Emphasize the range of data sources if they exist. If the student was delayed in applying for accommodations, the DRP should clearly address this and explain the delay. Third, DRPs should focus on the rationale for the specific accommodations that the student is requesting on their STEP exam. In medical school, students might experience barriers similar to those they will experience on these exams. Still, it is important that each accommodation requested is considered in the specific testing of the STEP exam. If you remember from the prior webinar, Sue outlined the details of the Step 1 and 2 exams. These elements are so important because they contribute directly to the inequity experienced by the student. In concluding their letter, DRP should indicate any additional data points that are additive to the request. They should provide their contact information, inviting the NBME to reach out directly with any questions. As with the provider documentation, these letters should be signed and dated. So having an understanding of the key elements of these letters is essential. Here are a few other things to keep in mind. First, utilize your own experiences with the student as additive. For example, if your student is typically late with responding to emails or has incurred professionalism violations connected to their disability, it's important to share these so long as the student is comfortable. You may need to remind them that the accommodations process is highly confidential, and this information would not be disclosed outside of NBME disability services. Second, utilize subheadings throughout your letter. This allows for clear, emphatic communication of your information. Third, be mindful of the language used. Our team will emphasize this more in our final webinar, but be sure to use strong language that's rooted in equity and need, not preference, or suggesting accommodations would be helpful. Accommodations are a matter of necessity, and they allow students to fully express their knowledge without disability limiting inequities.
At this time, we would love to welcome questions from you all. Please enter your questions into the Q&A and we'll get to as many as possible. While you begin populating the Q&A with your questions, we want to remind you that our third and final webinar will take place on October 18th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will go over how to assist students in writing compelling personal statements and provide an overview of the writing prompts from the updated guide.
Sarah, I just sent you a question.
That's great. So before we dive into the questions, we just wanted to share some additional resources from the Docs with Disabilities initiative. So you can find our resources at www.docswithdisabilities.org. And let's keep the conversation going on social media. You can find us on Twitter at DocsWith, on Instagram at Docs with Disabilities Initiative using our hashtags, hashtag Docs with Disabilities, hashtag Access in Medicine, and hashtag Access in Med Ed. Okay, so let's get to the questions, and Grace, please feel free to stop sharing so we can all see one another. And yeah, I'd love to get into the questions here. Okay.
Sarah,
So our first to you. Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
it was text to you. It was a great question that was asked.
Oh, okay. Sure. So it looks like the question reads, I'm a relatively new DRP in a school of medicine that is a part of a larger university enterprise, which approves and denies accommodations for students. I have been able to certify prior test accommodations, but I do not have the capacity to write letters of support for the quantity of students who are requesting accommodations through USMLE. I didn't even know letters of support were permitted, and I've never seen it on the USMLE website. Is this going to harm my students' chances of being granted STEP accommodation? So yeah, fabulous question. And I'll take a stab at it and then welcome Becca or Kara if you want to add anything to it. I would say the short answer is no, it shouldn't automatically disadvantage the student. And I think it highlights two things. So one being the sort of the systemic challenges in that many of you have very large caseloads, and we know writing these letters takes 15 hours probably on average. And so certainly that can become very impossible very quickly. But I think it highlights, so that's problem number one, caseloads is a challenge inherent to many in these positions. But two is, how do we then use what we have to do, that is the certification of prior accommodations form, and to hit that mean of the letter of support. And so it is a tough form in terms of space, but just use it wisely and be really careful in your language really highlighting what is the functional impact for that student during testing, and how is that going to be evidenced on the STEP exam. And so there are probably environments, like we said, where you'll see a student experience those functional impact when they're testing in medical school, and that can carry over and carry weight. So I would say definitely it's a challenge that many people are going to face, but one that will not in and of itself preclude your student. Anything to add, Kara or Becca?
I would just add to that, if you don't have a chance to write a letter or don't have the bandwidth to write a letter initially, if that student goes through the reconsideration process, you might choose to write a letter of support at that time. So maybe not up front with that initial packet, application packet, but maybe if they go through a reconsideration process.
Great point.
I would say that if you don't have time to do a separate letter of support, something that would take less time but would be incredibly helpful is for you to review all the other documents, including the student's personal statement, their provider documentation, anything the student is comfortable with sharing, because you can help them not get held up in other parts of the process. So it's even more important to do that if you can't, if you aren't going to be able to do that letter of support.
Yeah. So let's see here. Another question that is or I think will be interesting to address for the group. This person asks, is there any advice on what students should do if they are again denied test accommodations after a reconsideration request to the NBME? Any thoughts?
You only get one reconsideration, so just to make that clear, there's not another reconsideration. I haven't seen anyone have, typically if there's evidence of some condition, at least extra break time has been very commonly provided. So helping the students see what they do have to work with, then focusing on strategies. So if they have dyslexia, find out some dyslexia specific strategies that would help them best utilize the time they have. If they have ADHD, whatever the issues are, trying to get them specific strategies to do the best with the time that they've got, and essentially move forward from there. Do you guys have anything to add?
Yeah. I think the only thing I would add is, and I think it's a great point. The other thing I would add is really, this is another time to think really carefully and consider how severe the need is. And my gut would be, if you and the student really talk through the exam, and even though it's been denied twice, it feels like this is essential. This is absolutely, they cannot be successful on this exam and have equitable access on this exam without the accommodations. My gut would be to pursue applying again. That being said, I do think sometimes there are strategies where, not perfect, can at least give the student some support that I think are worth exploring, which is kind of where you were going with that, Becca.
Great suggestions. I'll just add one little thing, and that is some of our campuses have other resources that are available to students. And so I would encourage, if they haven't already tapped into those resources and exhausted those resources, to tap into the resources that might be able to assist them with enhancing those study strategies, those preparation strategies, taking a look at those practice exams. What is the outcome of those? And then also those test taking strategies. So in the moment, so getting them connected with other campus resources if they're not already connected.
Great. So this one feels like a good one for you, Becca. We'll start there. What kind of documentation helps students get accommodations if they have been recently diagnosed and don't have a history of accommodations?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I can tell you if it's something that is very clearly a physical issue, like the student has sustained some kind of injury that caused neurological damage, or something that is permanent or at least long-term. So it's not like a bone that will heal in a few months. Or maybe they had a stroke or something like that happened to them. That's usually not much of an issue. if we're talking about something like ADHD, I see this happen most often with ADHD, where students have had it for years. Maybe their family didn't believe it was a thing and never got them tested, or there are all sorts of reasons, or it's a resource issue being able to pay for it. The key thing is to be able, as far back as you can, to show evidence that the condition's symptoms were there, that you were affected by that condition, even if the diagnosis happened later. That can be helpful. It can be extremely helpful to have documentation from other related contexts, such as if someone has been in clinicals, if they have someone who's been a clinical preceptor who can attest to those daily effects, like how the ADHD affects them on the job. And it's extremely important in the case of ADHD, particularly, to have not just a medical diagnosis, like a DSM-5 diagnosis, but to have that full battery of testing done by a neuropsychologist or neuropsychiatrist.
Thank you. So hopefully that's a bit helpful. We had another question. Do you have any specific advice regarding the NBME accommodation request process, or ways in which the process may differ significantly from the NBME process? So great question. Really, though, the NBME is the allopathic version. The NBME is its own entity and also makes its own decisions. So this guide does not, unfortunately, cover at osteopathic schools. I imagine some of the tenets can stay the same, but there's not the nuance of the specifics in this guide. So another question we have here. Are students with accommodations for step 1 or other step exams provided accommodations if they sign up to take the simulated exam at the Prometric Center?
I don't think so. I'm not positive.
Yeah.
But I've never heard back from a student that said that they got them on the day that they had the test.
That's been my experience as well. It seems like, Carrie, you're nodding along. I think it's a great question, though, and I think it's something we can, as a team, share with the NBME and follow back on if this is an option. But I've had the same experience. Granted, I think it's always interesting. Students are sometimes less interested in spending the money for that free 120 at the Prometric site, though it's definitely an encouraged opportunity. But we love to follow up on that. And I think you can also reach out to the NBME and ask them. They're very approachable and will answer these questions. And so just getting a sense of from them, is this a possibility, I think is a great idea. Okay.
And you can, in working with the student, help them figure out the timing to simulate what their own accommodations will be like in the exam. So every time they do a practice test, to simulate the same break times, the same number of questions. So if they have blocks of 20 instead of blocks of 40, for example, you want them to be able to simulate that. So help them with that process.
Great. So this attendee asked, I work with a student who requests double time and break time on step 1, but the student reported that the accommodation request form can only allow students to check off 50% extra time and additional break time. Can you provide some guidance on this? Thank you. Any thoughts, Kara, Rebecca?
I have never known anyone who was able to get double break time on the NBME exam, even if they had, double testing time, even if that was the standard accommodation they had at the school. I had not noticed if it's not on the form, but for the additional break time, the standard additional break time is 50% extra break time. That's just what additional break time means, has always been my understanding.
And I think one of the things I would agree, Becca, I have also not had a student request that specific accommodation. That being said,
I've had people request it in the past, write it in there was an
that was what I was going to say.
They did write it in. Yeah, sorry, they did write it in on the form. But it hasn't been
Yeah. Yeah,
provided.
so that was my suggestion, is there are things that aren't on the form and there's a place you can write those in. And I would just be careful and thoughtful about, if that is the request, make sure that the evidence is really there to support that request, because it is a steep one. It is something that you're going to need some real strong objective evidence to support. That being said, certainly that could exist. But I think there's always that careful line to walk with students, where we're supporting their needs, but also advising them very carefully and specifically based on what objective evidence is there and our experiences with the process as well.
And I think we can immediately answer the next one with the same thing. The write-in option that we were talking about, the next question is about a student who wants to use note paper instead of a dry erase board for notes. That's that sort of thing that isn't provided as a standard, can be requested through the write-in. They need justification for that. And I'm not sure about just being left-handed.
Right.
I don't know if is the dry erase board posted inside? That's something that no students ever mentioned to me. I got the impression that it was loose.
I think they have it. I think the person is imagining that they're going to have difficulty writing, but I think you're correct in that being left-handed in and of itself is not a disability per se. So I think there is something to explore there. I think we'll have time for maybe one or two more questions, maybe just one. So we'll keep track of these as we did next time too, and hopefully at the end be able to come back to any we didn't get to. This question reads, can you say more, or is it in the guide, on testing for brain injury and stroke? I've had several letters from well-qualified doctors that say the full battery of achievement testing usually used for ADHD, et cetera, is not appropriate for brain injury, concussion, or stroke. And recent tests, like GIST reasoning, are not yet well established, but the Nelson-Denny is also not accepted.
I would just kind of bring up this point. So like when we say that the full battery of achievement testing, well, that's used with an educational diagnostician for ADHD definitely isn't a good analog for someone when we're assessing brain function after brain injury or stroke. But a neuropsychologist or neuropsychiatrist should know how to select the correct battery to match that. And when we're talking about brain injury and stroke, there are a lot of medical functions that need to be measured. For the purposes of this exam, we're measuring more the cognitive functions. And so it may be that what's appropriate as a measure for this purpose is different than what's appropriate for a measure for a medical purpose. I hope that helps.
Wonderful. So we'll make sure to jot all these other questions. We tried to get to most of them, but you all had so many wonderful questions. And I want to again thank the NBME for providing answers to the questions we were able to submit ahead of time. And we are so grateful you came today, and we're looking forward to joining you for the final webinar and the launch of the NBME guide in just a few weeks. So thank you everyone so much.